All right, we're back. Hey guys, sorry again, I'm absent today on a field trip with the science classes. Sorry, I'm filming another video just to make sure that I keep you guys on track. I know for some classes, nearly everybody is absent for the field trip today, but for other classes, we have a lot of people in person. So in order to keep everybody on track, to keep us moving through, I wanted to make another video. Just make sure that we're continuing our discussion on World War II and taking as much time as we can. For some of you guys, you'll be ahead of the game. We'll touch base on this with the entire class tomorrow again on Wednesday. But for others of you, this will be a good opportunity for our class to get a little bit ahead of the notes and take care of business. The subject that we're going to be talking about today, though, is deserving of our discussion in class together as well. So as we're talking about how the United States actually gets involved in the war and the first steps we take towards waging war in the Pacific, we'll talk about it here. I'll give you some notes on it here, but I'll also follow up with all of you guys in person on Wednesday. So let's get started. I got my notes here, so I'll be referring to those as we go through. Again, like last week when I was absent, feel free to pause the video if you need some more time to take the notes. I'll be going through, giving you, just walking through each of the notes here, and then also explaining a little bit of what's going on. So again, if I'm going a little bit faster than your note-taking is, that's totally fine. Feel free to pause the video and move forward when you're ready. Cool? Great. Again, this won't be as comprehensive, not as long as last week's video, because we will be talking about this again in person. But if you're in person today taking these notes, you'll be a little bit ahead of the game, and we'll be ready to talk about it on Wednesday. All right, here we go. So again, as we were talking about, just going back, the last thing we talked about were the Neutrality Acts and the Lend-Lease Act, really recognizing that the United States is ready to enter World War II, but we're doing it economically, financially, where we're giving financial support to the Allies. And what we'll talk about today is we're actually revoking financial support from some of the Axis powers as well, namely Japan, who's dependent upon our trade agreements with them. We'll start removing some of those negotiations with them. We'll stop working with them diplomatically, and they'll try to negotiate that. We'll try to negotiate with them, reestablish terms. But at the end of the day, we realize that our relationship with Japan is irreconcilable as they stay in their current form of government. So let's talk about it. So the United States joins World War II. In response to Japan's alliance with Germany, as well as Italy, and their territorial expansion in Asia, the United States passes a near-total embargo on Japan. And I've mentioned this word embargo before, but this is the point where I'd like you to know exactly what it is. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more. I'll flesh out the idea a little bit more when we're all together. But essentially, an embargo is a restriction on all trade with another country. So we pass a total embargo with Japan on all military supplies. So anything, any provisions, any materials, any, I would say, auto manufacturing, anything that could go towards their war effort, anything that could support their war effort, we cut off trade with them. And some of Japan's auto manufacturers that we partner with, even after the war, we'll partner with some of those companies like Mitsubishi. We'll work with Chrysler. But for now, we cut off those agreements and we don't reestablish them until like the 70s. So Japan has to kind of figure out what to do without the U.S. support. And essentially, they realize that they can't move on, at least not effectively, without our support. And that also means that in a way, the United States is somewhat supporting the war effort in Japan. With our trade with them, the money they're making off of trade and the materials that they're receiving in trade from us are directly helping their war effort. And we don't have an interest in doing that any longer. As we learn more about the Japanese Empire and what they're doing in China and Manchuria, we have no interest in continuing our agreements with them and our negotiations with them. And we say as much. So Japanese and American officials meet together and they discuss the terms of how to adjust this and how to change this. And essentially the American officials say, change your government or we're not going to continue working with you. Break your agreements with the other Axis powers. Stop working with Hitler, stop working with Mussolini, or we're going to continue this embargo against you. And so we start out with a restriction on military supplies to Japan from the United States. That's our embargo. And then we have this man, Hideki Tojo, who I've talked about with some of you, and some of you will recognize this guy. Tojo is a general in the Japanese Empire who became the Prime Minister of Japan in 1941, just a few months before the attacks on Pearl Harbor. The idea behind the Pearl Harbor attacks began long before Tojo became Prime Minister, but essentially he's the one who approves the plans and moves forward with Japan attacking Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. So, initially, he tried to keep the United States neutral in the war and attempted to end that embargo that I was just talking about. But as we said, when negotiations fell through, he approves those plans for Japan's military to begin mobilizing for that attack on Pearl Harbor. So Tojo is the guy responsible for this. Tojo, as a military leader in a militarized Japan, effectively takes over the government of Japan. Not that the government before him was adverse to the actions of the military, but at this point, the military kind of takes over governmental and legal leadership of Japan as well. So Tojo is at the center of this, and he's the one who approves that battle strategy. Again, even though that had already been a plan that was set and kind of prepared to go into motion before he became prime minister, he's the one that approves it. Cool? All right, let's keep moving. On December 7th of 1941, Japanese fighter pilots and bombers attacked the United States Pacific Fleet, taking off from aircraft carriers that sailed to Hawaii. So this is the official moment, the official final act, the final domino that falls before the United States joins World War II, and I hope we're all pretty much familiar with this event. But it took a while. It took till 1941 for the United States to actually say, all right, we're going to mobilize and we're going to plan to engage ourselves in this combat. However, the same day that we declare war on the Axis powers, they also declare war on us. Not just Japan, but also Germany declares war on us the day following the Pearl Harbor attack. They know what's coming in the same way that we know we must respond to it. So, the goal of the attack, I want you to understand why the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor in the first place. And this should make a little bit of sense, but the American naval fleet, the Pacific Fleet for the United States, was stationed out of Hawaii. That was one of the desires that we had for acquiring Hawaii as a territory in the first place, was for us to be able to acquire it as a place for our ships to be able to port at, be able to fuel at, and also to have pretty solid direct access to East Asia, which we didn't have before, right? There is a good deal of ocean between California and East Asia, and while there's still a good deal of ocean between Hawaii and nations like Japan and China, it's far closer. So the United States is going, like we talked about before, the United States overthrows Queen Liliuokalani, establishes those revolts, the farmer revolts, and we establish Hawaii as a territory of the United States, promptly commissioning that military base at Pearl Harbor that was established back in 1850. So the goal of the attack is for Japan to effectively knock out the Pacific Fleet of the American Navy, taking us out of a potential war in Asia before we could even officially join the conflict. And that means, if they're attacking us before we officially join the conflict, that means that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a sneak attack, which is a war crime. I want to emphasize that. This is the first of very many war crimes that the Japanese army is going to, the Japanese military as a whole is going to enact against the U.S. military. And a sneak attack is against conventional warfare, right? So you can't send your military to attack a target that you haven't declared war on. The United States was officially neutral in the battle, right? We weren't a part of World War II before this, and so it's officially a war crime for Japan to seize military action against us. So while devastating, the attack on Pearl Harbor only knocked the United States Navy out of World War II for about 6 months. Now, obviously, a lot happened in those 6 months, and they were some of the messiest 6 months of our entire Pacific campaign. But regardless, at the threat of this attack possibly knocking our Navy out of the Pacific theater entirely, that really, all things considered, is not that bad. The picture on the screen there, if my head is out of the way, if I edited myself away from the picture enough in post here, the picture is of the USS Arizona sinking into the harbor. The USS Arizona was one of the naval vessels that was sunk in the Pearl Harbor attacks. It is still there today. The memorial at Pearl Harbor on Oahu is built on top of the wreckage of the USS Arizona. And to this day, if you go to the site, I did back in 2012, I believe. It was still, when I went there, when I visited, it was still leaking oil. And to this day, I believe, as far as I'm aware, it is still leaking oil. So if you go there, you can see the oil from the wreckage continuing to bubble to the surface. This was a devastating attack. This was not the only ship we lost, but it should have been, could have been, and should have been way worse. The attack was devastating, but it only knocked us out of World War II for about 6 months. The aircraft carriers were out at sea. All of our aircraft carriers, which would have been the primary target, right? Because they're naval vessels that also allow our Air Force to take off from them, right? Airplanes being able to join the combat. The aircraft carriers were out for training during the attack, so they were unharmed. The Japanese had an opportunity to send a third fleet out to attack them, and they actually decided not to do that. So that bit of conservative military leadership actually held them back. And I know it's rare for us to talk about the Japanese military as conservative in any way, but that's effectively what ended up causing us to remobilize the Navy as fast as we did. The Japanese also failed to eliminate fuel depots and repair stations on Oahu, which were also some of their primary targets. So, again, while I don't want to diminish how devastating this is and how significant an attack on U.S. soil is, because essentially that's what gets the public on board with this war, is the Japanese did attack us on our soil. While that's super significant, it could have been and should have been way worse. And so, as I say here, with an attack on U.S. soil, Americans overwhelmingly supported going to war, and the House of Representatives votes on December 8th, 388-1 in favor of joining the conflict of World War II. And so FDR will give his Day of Infamy speech, which we'll talk about again more when I get to you guys in person. And the United States mobilizes for war. It is a fast turnaround. That's another thing that we'll discuss in person together, how fast the entire economy mobilizes for war, who gets involved, how everybody gets involved. It's actually remarkable. It's considered a wartime miracle how fast we mobilize in support of World War II. And that's just to show that while I've been telling you, and I will continue to tell you, how morally complicated all types of warfare are, it goes to show how important and how necessary World War II seemed to the American public. Everybody, for the most part, there is overwhelming support for us to go to war with the Axis powers. And for those Americans that aren't in support of that, FDR is actually speaking out not just against the Axis powers as a whole, but he's speaking out against those Americans who support the Axis powers as well. So even the president himself is actively speaking out against Americans who are in favor of or just simply are neutral towards the Axis powers. He says they're an evil that must be defeated. I talked to you last week about the incendiary bomb comment about the Axis powers and Hitler in particular. But what I don't think we talk about enough, or maybe we just don't emphasize it enough about American involvement in World War II, is it doesn't start with us focusing on Hitler. We don't attack Hitler directly, at least at first. We leave that to the Europeans to begin with, and we fight our war in the Pacific. So after the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, the Marines mobilize in order to train their first groups of troops to sail directly to the Pacific Islands. And you might know exactly where they're headed if you remember our discussion of the U.S. territories that we gained after the Spanish-American War. They're headed directly to the Philippines. They would have gone to Guam as well, but before we could actually mobilize, Guam was pretty much entirely overtaken by the Japanese. And so by the time we get most of our forces to the Philippines, they mobilize to protect the Philippines, and we also travel to a bunch of the other Pacific islands, like the Solomon Islands. That's Guadalcanal is in the Solomon Islands. If you're familiar with that HBO series, The Pacific, that's where they focus on. So a lot of the U.S. forces are going to just disperse out into the islands and figure out what are the most strategically advantageous places for us to position our troops in order to stop the Japanese from expanding their territory, not just in mainland Asia, but also in the Pacific Islands leading to like Australia as well. All right, let's keep going. So let's talk about how that actually impacts the war in Europe. Now, just because we don't get involved in the war directly in Europe, at least not yet, not with troops on the ground, aside from a few that actually end up joining in and training with the British troops, some in Canada, some go directly to London themselves. There are a few U.S. pilots who end up serving in the British Air Force, which is awesome. There's nothing cooler than an American flying a Spitfire, at least in my opinion. And again, we'll talk about that. If you're unfamiliar with World War II aircraft, I'll probably bug you guys by how much I talk about it later on. So in Europe, Germany violates that Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact that they signed a couple years before, and they set their sights on Moscow. Now, together in class, I think in all of my classes, we got to the point where we talked about Germany taking over France and nearly knocking not just France, but Britain out of the war entirely. So Germany, whether they underestimate the power of the British military or they assume the Allied powers to already be effectively defeated after taking Paris, they kind of pull the trigger a little bit early and set their sights on Russia, start attacking Russia. So they turn their back on their ally Russia and they focus on the Eastern Front, establishing an Eastern Front of the war. So they'll begin attacking the Soviets. And what happens at the same time is, though Germany is looking at the Soviets and is saying, okay, we're going to attack them from their west, but we're not going to be alone. They're expecting Japan to also get involved in this conflict, right? So Stalin and the Soviets join the Allied powers and Germany's Eastern Front begins. But again, Germany is expecting this to be not just a war on two fronts for them, but also, and more essentially, for Russia as well, because they'll have to fend off two of the major Axis powers at the same time. But with the United States beginning their fight in the Pacific, Russia fears an attack. While Russia is fearing that attack coming from Japan, that the impact of that attack is actually minimized by the fact that the United States is taking on Japan in such a large way in the Pacific. So Russia is able to focus nearly all of their efforts on fighting Hitler because the United States is mobilizing to the Pacific. So you think about it this way. Japan, without the United States getting involved in the war, Japan would have been able to focus a lot of their efforts on Russia directly, right? Possibly invading Russia or at least being a major nuisance to them in their Asian territory, right? However, because the United States is getting involved in the Pacific and because that's obviously pretty significant for the Japanese to consider, they have to mobilize a lot of their troops into the Pacific Islands. They have to maintain a large military presence in those areas, and so they can't send as big a force to Russia, and as a matter of fact, they don't end up sending a significant offensive into Russia at all. So Russia, without the fear of Japan, is able to focus all of their effort now on Germany. So U.S. and Filipino troops began to mobilize in the Pacific, but the war in Asia began horrifically for us. So we'll talk just briefly when I get back with you guys about Russia and Germany and what's going on there. But really what I'll focus on for the rest of this week is the beginning of the war in the Pacific with us and what's going to happen when we set boots on the ground. United States and Filipino troops mobilize in the Pacific starting at the end of 1941, and the main forces will begin at the start of 1942. It's going to be a mess. 1942 is not really our year, but the things that we set up and the small victories that we win in 1942 end up propping us up for the rest of the war, in which, if you're ready to fly the American flag proudly, that's our time to shine. 1942, not a great year for the United States at war in World War II, but the rest of the war is going to be remarkable for us. We are going to learn military strategies to counteract Japanese offensives. We're going to learn the tactics of the Nazi army as well, and we're going to get ready to mobilize for Europe as well. So, At the beginning of the war, though, Asia was a mess for us. The Pacific theater was a mess. It began horrifically. We faced aggressive and passionate Japanese forces who concerned themselves very little with international law and war crimes. The Japanese were willing to do anything they thought was necessary to win the war. And we'll talk about some of those tactics. I would be doing a disservice, and we wouldn't be able to understand the gravity of how awful some of these military tactics were if I didn't describe them. And at the same time, I'll try to spare you some of the gruesome details. But we'll talk about what's necessary for us to understand in order for us to feel the weight of this war. Because warfare is messy, and we have to be able to talk about that in order to understand how awful war tends to be, even wars that are fought for righteous causes, as a lot of people tend to agree World War II was, right? Fighting against the Nazis, fighting against fascist Italy, and fighting against the Empire of Japan, they're seen as noble causes, and I don't disagree with that. I think they are. And yet, at the same time, though this war might have been necessary, it's still a mess. It's still awful. And part of the atrocity is dealing with an enemy that cares not for the rules of war. And it might seem weird that we have humane and inhumane ways to kill people in battle, and yet, when we talk about this, you might come to an understanding that without those rules of engagement for battle, we can fall to nasty atrocities. And it's not something that we really desire for ourselves. There is a standard for combat. And again, that's something that I want to talk about a little bit more with you in person. So I'm going to leave us off here. I don't want to take this on too much longer. I wish you the best of luck with the rest of today. If you still have time in your classes, please take some time and review some of the material that we've already discussed for this semester. I want you guys to prepare well for our upcoming quizzes and tests. So take a look through your notes. Start to familiarize yourself with some of the content that we've been discussing, because I do plan on having a quiz on some of this World War II material. And then once we finish up World War II and our discussion on it, I will start prepping us for a test. Cool? Great. All right, thanks, guys. That's about all I've got. Have a great day. I look forward to seeing you in class again tomorrow. God bless.